The ocean has carried travelers for centuries, but it has also taken them without warning. Aircraft that should have been safe, with skilled crews and clear skies, have vanished into silence. No distress calls, no wreckage, only the unanswered quiet of the sea. In these stories, there are no conclusions offered, only the facts as they were recorded, flight plans filed, weather conditions noted, final transmissions logged, and the silence that followed. Each case unfolded over the same waters from the late 1940s into the Cold War years, leaving families without closure and investigators without evidence. These disappearances became part of what is now known as the Bermuda Triangle, a place not marked on any official chart, but remembered for the aircraft that entered it and never returned. We will look at them carefully, one by one, presenting only what is known and nothing more. Join us, the pilot who called for help from the past. On the 11th of September 1954, a Pan American Airways flight was making its way toward Miami, Florida. It was a clear evening, with weather reports noting only scattered clouds and calm winds. Air traffic controllers in the Miami Tower were accustomed to the steady rhythm of incoming transatlantic flights, but one of the calls that came across their radios that night was not routine. A voice broke through the static, urgent yet strangely distant, claiming to belong to a pilot in distress. Controllers wrote down the words as best they could. The pilot gave his aircraft type as a Douglas DC-4, a 4-engined propeller plane. He reported being lost, unable to locate his position, and running low on fuel. His request was simple. He needed a bearing to Miami. At first, this did not seem unusual. Pilots sometimes lost their bearings over water, especially at night. But the details that followed troubled the staff in the control tower. The call sign, the aircraft model, and even the voice pattern did not match any registered flight that day. When asked for his registration, the pilot gave an identification number linked to a DC-4 that had disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle almost 30 years earlier, in 1925. The controllers at Miami were unsure how to respond. Their equipment confirmed that the transmission was real, yet no radar showed an incoming plane. The man repeated his distress call, describing his altitude and fuel status. "We must be near Miami," he said, "but cannot see the lights of the city." The tower advised him to maintain his heading and prepare for vectors, but after a few more broken transmissions, the signal faded into static. Investigators who reviewed the incident later found no evidence of any missing flight in 1954. No aircraft had been reported overdue or lost in that region at the time. The distress call was logged officially, yet no wreckage, no crash reports, and no radar traces followed. To the controllers who heard it, the pilot had sounded alive, coherent, and entirely certain of his location in time. The mystery gained further weight when compared to earlier cases. In 1948, British South American Airways Flight 138, the Star Tiger, had vanished en route to Bermuda with 31 people on board. Just 1 year later, in 1949, another aircraft of the same airline, the Star Ariel, disappeared without a trace on its way from Bermuda to Kingston, Jamaica. Both were Avro Tudor 4 planes, large passenger aircraft of the post-war years. Both were in clear weather and both vanished over the same region. The 1954 transmission seemed to echo those disappearances. Among aviation researchers, the incident is sometimes linked to Flight NC 16002, a Douglas DC-3 that vanished on the 28th of December 1948. That aircraft, carrying 32 passengers and crew, was approaching Miami from San Juan, Puerto Rico. It disappeared without a trace, only 50 miles from its destination. Weather was calm, the crew reported no problems, and no wreckage was ever recovered. Records show that its captain, Robert Lindquist, sent a routine message at 4:13 p.m., saying he expected to arrive shortly. After that, silence. Some speculate that the 1954 radio call could have matched the voice of a pilot from that lost DC-3. Others point to even older cases. In December 1945, Flight 19, a group of 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers from the US Debakis Navy, disappeared after becoming disoriented during a training mission. Their instructor, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, reported compass failures and conflicting headings. Despite extensive searches, neither the planes nor the crews were ever found. Their last messages contained confusion about their location, with the belief they might be over the Florida Keys when in fact they were further east. The 1954 case remained distinct because the transmission was received by multiple operators at Miami, all noting the same aircraft type and call sign. The controllers insisted they had spoken with a real pilot. Official records filed that night list unexplained transmission received, with no further clarification. In subsequent years, the log entry circulated among aviation circles, sometimes cited in discussions of temporal anomalies or unexplained phenomena in the Bermuda Triangle. Reports from the U.S. Civil Aeronautics Administration note that all operating aircraft on the 11th of September 1954 were accounted for. No overdue arrivals, no missing flights, and no emergency landings. The transmission could not be traced to any known call frequency assigned to Pan American Airways or its affiliates. The voice was described as calm yet increasingly desperate, with background noise consistent with propeller engines rather than jets. This matched the claim of flying a DC-4, an aircraft type already being phased out of service by the mid-1950s. The Bermuda Triangle, covering the area between Miami, Bermuda, and San Juan, has long been associated with aviation mysteries. During World War II, dozens of aircraft reported compass problems when passing through the region. Naval logs from the early 1942s describe magnetic interference near certain coordinates, with compasses spinning or freezing. Pilots were instructed to cross-check with celestial navigation whenever possible. By the 1952s, radar and improved radio equipment had reduced such incidents, but occasional unexplained reports persisted. One striking detail in the 1954 case is the absence of radar contact. Miami's radar station, already in use by then, scanned the skies constantly. The controllers who heard the pilot could not reconcile the vivid, repeated calls for help with the empty screens in front of them. To them, it was as if the voice was real, but the aircraft did not exist. Newspaper archives from September 1954 make no mention of a lost flight that week. The story circulated only in internal aviation reports, and was later recalled by individuals who had worked in Miami Tower. It reached broader attention in the 1970s, when the Bermuda Triangle became a subject of popular books and documentaries. The 1954 voice was described in some accounts as a pilot calling from the past, though no conclusive link has ever been proven. The details remain fixed in the logbook, date, time, frequency, and the recorded words of a man who identified his plane as a Douglas DC-4. His insistence on being near Miami, his repeated requests for vectors, and the final silence that followed all remain without explanation. The vanished Convair of 1963. On the 5th of June 1963, a US Air Force Convair C-133 Cargomaster lifted off from Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. The heavy-lift aircraft was bound for the Lajes Field Air Base in the Azores, with a scheduled stop for refueling before continuing on to Europe. The C-133 had been designed for a very specific role during the Cold War, the transport of oversized and heavy cargo that other aircraft could not carry. It was capable of lifting intercontinental ballistic missiles, main battle tanks, or entire assemblies of equipment. At the time, it stood among the largest propeller-driven aircraft in military service. Weather reports from that morning describe clear skies and good visibility. No storms threatened the flight path. Winds were steady and not strong enough to affect the schedule. The crew of 7 were experienced airmen, familiar with long-haul military transport missions across the Atlantic. Each of them had completed the training required for the Cargomaster, which by 1963 had been in service for several years. For those at Dover, it seemed like another routine departure. The first stage of the flight progressed exactly as expected. Radio communication remained routine, with position reports placing the aircraft well along its intended course. The C-133 maintained an altitude near 20,000 feet, cruising smoothly toward the midpoint of its journey. Then, at approximately 1,300 miles east of Delaware, the crew sent what would become their final transmission. It was calm, brief, and gave no hint of distress. There was no indication of mechanical trouble, no reference to weather, and no sign of urgency. After that single report, silence followed. When the aircraft failed to arrive in the Azores, an immediate search was organized. The United States Navy dispatched ships and patrol planes. Canadian and Portuguese vessels joined, widening the net across the Atlantic. In total, nearly 100,000 square miles of ocean were searched, yet not a single trace of the missing convoy was located. No debris fields, no oil slicks, no life rafts, and no emergency beacons were recovered. For an aircraft of such size, carrying significant cargo, this complete absence of evidence was highly unusual. Crashes at sea normally leave at least fragments to be discovered, but here the Atlantic offered nothing. Air Force records show that the aircraft had been declared mechanically sound before departure. Maintenance logs revealed no unresolved faults. The fuel load had been checked and was sufficient for the long oceanic leg. The crew had filed no reports of difficulty, nor had they deviated from the assigned route. The loss was therefore classified as unknown causes. Families of the 7 men received the official notification, but beyond the acknowledgement of disappearance, there was little explanation to offer. The Convair C-133 already had a reputation among pilots as a challenging aircraft to operate. Introduced in the late 1950s, its long fuselage and powerful turboprop engines made it capable of carrying outsized cargo, including the Atlas and Titan missile system. Its length measured over 150 feet, making it one of the largest aircraft of its generation. But this size came at a cost. Pilots reported that the aircraft was prone to vibrations, especially during long flights. Under turbulence, the design placed unusual stress on its wings and fuselage. Several cone 133 seconds had been lost in structural failures, yet in those cases, the crews had usually been able to send distress calls. The 1963 incident was different precisely because it ended without warning. Declassified records, released decades later, confirmed that the cargo that day included spare missile components. These were not complete warheads, but support equipment for systems then in deployment. The weight of the load fell within normal limits, and nothing unusual was recorded in the loading documentation. Pilots who flew the C-133 at the time commented that while vibrations were common, they rarely produced sudden catastrophic failures. For this reason, the abrupt disappearance of the June 1963 flight remained unexplained. Some aviation historians have drawn comparisons between this loss and earlier cases linked to the Bermuda Triangle. The Convair was not flying within the triangle's usual boundaries, but it was operating over the Western Atlantic, a region with a long record of disappearances. The absence of wreckage mirrored cases such as the Star Tiger in 1948 and the Star Ariel in 1949, both large passenger planes that vanished in good weather and left no trace despite extensive searches. The official Air Force investigation concluded later in 1963 with no clear findings. The report labelled the event presumed lost at sea and suggested, without evidence, the possibility of sudden structural failure. Families of the crew were left only with the statement that their loved ones had disappeared somewhere between Delaware and the Azores. No physical evidence was ever recovered to clarify the fate of the aircraft. Press coverage was limited. A few short articles appeared in regional newspapers, mentioning a missing transport plane, but details were sparse. The Cold War context often meant that military incidents received little public discussion. Within a few weeks, the disappearance faded from headlines. Only in later decades, as researchers compiled records of aviation mysteries, did the story re-emerge. Ships that had been in the region on June 5 reported no unusual sights or sounds. Weather logs confirmed that conditions had been stable, with calm seas and light winds. No electrical storms or lightning were present. The silence on the radio following the final position report strongly suggested a sudden, and complete event. Whether mechanical, structural, or another cause entirely, it gave no warning. The Convair C-133 remained in service with the US Air Force until the early 1972, when it was replaced by the Lockheed C-5 Galaxy. Only 50 were built, and nearly 10% were lost to accidents. Yet even among those losses, the 1963 case stands out for its lack of evidence. Most other accidents left wreckage, survivors, or distress signals. This one left nothing at all. For decades, the case remained a quiet entry in Air Force files. In the 1982, declassification of certain Cold War documents revealed the full extent of the search. They confirmed that more than a dozen ships and aircraft participated, covering an immense area of ocean. They also confirmed the complete absence of results. The files acknowledged the unusual nature of the disappearance, but stopped short of suggesting causes beyond mechanical failure. To researchers of unsolved aviation mysteries, the vanished Convair is now grouped with the unexplained disappearances of the mid-20th century. Its circumstances align with the familiar pattern: a large aircraft, clear weather, routine radio contact, no distress call, no deviation from course, and a total lack of wreckage. Though technically outside the Bermuda Triangle, its story is often mentioned alongside those cases. The Atlantic crossing, once one of the most daunting routes in aviation, has been the site of many such vanishings. Each time, the ocean has given nothing back. The C-133, its 7-man crew, and its cargo remain unaccounted for more than half a century later. To this day, the vanished Convair of 1963 is remembered only through the brief log entries, the names of its crew, and the silence that followed its last calm transmission. The flight that reported a time slip. On the 6th of January 1970, National Airlines Flight 727 departed from New York City, bound for Miami, Florida. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-8, one of the workhorses of commercial aviation during the late 1960s and early 1970s. On board were more than 100 passengers and a seasoned flight crew. The weather forecast showed scattered clouds, but no major disturbances along the route. For both crew and passengers, it was expected to be a typical domestic flight of a few hours. The journey south proceeded uneventfully until the aircraft entered a region of airspace over the western Atlantic, an area that overlaps with the boundaries of the Bermuda Triangle. At this point, the crew noticed an unusual change in their instruments. The chronometers used to measure elapsed flight time seemed to display readings that did not correspond to the expected progress of the flight. According to the captain's later statement, they appeared to lose several minutes in a way that could not be reconciled with their speed, altitude, or course. The first officer cross-checked the clocks with other systems, including the automatic distance measuring equipment, but the results continued to show irregularities. The discrepancy was not extreme, amounting to a gap of approximately 10 minutes, but it was enough to confuse and unsettle the crew. They contacted air traffic control for a position check, only to find that controllers had also noted the flight making better time than expected. Radar showed the DC-8 arriving on the Miami approach earlier than scheduled, despite no increase in ground speed being recorded by the crew. The anomaly was carefully logged in the flight records. Upon landing, the crew filed a detailed report with National Airlines and later with the Federal Aviation Administration. The captain described the sensation as if time itself had been altered. The statement emphasized that all other systems were normal, weather was stable, and there was no evidence of turbulence or instrument failure. Investigators examined the aircraft upon its arrival in Miami. Maintenance crews inspected the timekeeping instruments, the flight data, and the navigational systems. They found no faults. The DC-8 was declared fully operational, and no further irregularities were noted in subsequent flights. The pilots involved had long records of reliable service, and none had ever reported such an incident before. The so-called time slip of Flight 727 drew the attention of both aviation experts and researchers of unexplained phenomena. The case was documented in the FAA's internal logs, and later cited in reports about unusual events in the Bermuda Triangle. While the discrepancy in time amounted to only minutes, the fact that it was observed by multiple crew members and confirmed by ground control made it notable. The idea of missing time in aviation had been mentioned before. Pilots in the region had occasionally reported compass deviations, sudden drops or increases in airspeed readings, and unexplained gains or losses in distance. In the 1945 Flight 19 case, US Navy trainees repeatedly described compasses spinning or pointing incorrectly. In later decades, private pilots occasionally mentioned feeling disoriented, as though flights had taken less or more time than expected. None of these earlier accounts, however, were as carefully logged and cross-checked as the National Airlines case of 1970. Scientific explanations have been proposed. Some point to the possibility of strong jet streams, which can accelerate or slow an aircraft more than anticipated. Yet in this case, the meteorological records showed only moderate winds. Others have suggested that minor instrument malfunctions, though not detected by maintenance crews, could have produced confusing readings. Still, this would not account for the agreement between cockpit logs and radar positions observed on the ground. Theories that reached beyond conventional explanations quickly attached themselves to the case. Some writers speculated about distortions in space and time within the Bermuda Triangle region. Popular books of the 1970 seconds often included the Flight 727 event as evidence of temporal anomalies. Terms such as time warp and dimensional shift were applied, though aviation authorities never endorsed such interpretations. For the FAA, the incident remained an unresolved irregularity, officially closed without further investigation. Passenger recollections of the flight provide little detail. Most were unaware of the anomaly until it was reported afterward. A few later told newspapers that they had noticed arriving early, but assumed the pilot had simply made up time in the air. To them, the flight felt normal, with no turbulence or unusual announcements. The strange element existed primarily in the logs, instruments, and communications between cockpit and control tower. National Airlines itself did not highlight the incident. Like many airlines, it avoided drawing attention to unexplained occurrences, focusing instead on safety records and routine service. It was only when independent researchers requested FAA documentation years later that the story became widely known. By then, it was grouped alongside other cases from the region, forming part of the Bermuda Triangle narrative that grew throughout the 1970 seconds. The DC-8 continued in service for many years, and the crew members involved returned to normal operations. None of them ever reported a similar event again. Yet the anomaly of the 6th of January 1970 remained in their records, a small but puzzling moment in aviation history. The Bermuda Triangle itself had already gained a reputation by this time. The disappearances of the Star Tiger in 1948, the Star Ariel in 1949, and the DC-3 flight of 1948 had all been publicized. Flight 19 had entered popular memory through books, magazine articles, and television documentaries. The time slip of Flight 727 added a different dimension to the mystery, not disappearance, but distortion. The Atlantic air corridor between New York and Miami is one of the busiest in the United States. Hundreds of flights cross it daily, and very few ever report anomalies. That one crew, on one day in 1970, recorded an apparent loss of minutes continues to puzzle researchers. It did not involve the tragedy of a disappearance, nor the confusion of a distress call. Instead, it was an almost invisible deviation, hidden in the details of clocks, logbooks, and arrival times. The official record closes with the remark, "No fault found." For the crew, however, the flight remained a moment they could not explain. In the calm skies above the Atlantic that day, time itself seemed to skip forward, leaving only questions in its place. The disappearance of the flying boxcar. On the 5th of June 1965, a Fairchild C-119 flying boxcar of the United States Air Force departed from Homestead Air Force Base in Florida. The aircraft was scheduled for a routine transport mission across the Florida Straits, with Havana as its initial navigational checkpoint before continuing south. The C-119 was a twin-boom transport, first introduced in 1947 and widely used during the Korean War. It was known for its box-shaped fuselage, which gave it the name Flying Boxcar. By 1965, the aircraft was aging, but still in use for supply and troop movements. The weather that morning was reported as favourable. Visibility was excellent, with only light winds. No storms were present along the planned route. The crew consisted of 4 men, all with experience in both domestic and overseas operations. The flight departed at 7:47 a.m., climbing steadily to an assigned cruising altitude. Routine radio contact placed it well on course through the straits. At 8:22 a.m., a final communication was logged. The transmission was short and ordinary, a position report, calm in tone, with no reference to difficulties. After that, silence. When the aircraft did not report at its next checkpoint, attempts were made to raise the crew on multiple frequencies. No reply came. By late morning, a search and rescue operation was underway. US Navy and Coast Guard vessels swept across the Florida Straits, supported by reconnaissance aircraft. Over the next several days, they covered thousands of square miles of ocean. Despite clear conditions and concentrated effort, no wreckage was ever located. The C-119 had vanished without a trace. The Flying Boxcar was a large, distinctive aircraft. Its twin tails and bulky fuselage made it easy to identify, both in the air and from the sea. When accidents occurred, wreckage was usually visible within hours. In this case, the complete absence of debris surprised investigators. The region of the Florida Straits is busy with shipping lanes. Civilian vessels reported nothing unusual that morning. No explosions, no fires, no descending aircraft. The disappearance had occurred in one of the most traveled waterways in the world, yet it left no witnesses and no physical remains. Air Force records show the aircraft had passed its last inspection without issues. Maintenance logs confirm the engines and airframe were cleared for service. Fuel capacity was sufficient for the mission, and weight limits were not exceeded. The last transmission, recorded at 8:22, provided no sign of trouble. It gave location, heading, and altitude, and then ended as if the crew expected routine continuation of the flight. Investigators considered the possibility of sudden structural failure. By the mid-1960 seconds, the C-119 was already showing its age. Some aircraft in the fleet had suffered wing spar cracks or engine malfunctions. In most cases, however, such failures produced at least partial wreckage recoveries. Oil slicks, floating debris, or rafts were usually discovered even after catastrophic accidents. That nothing at all was found in 1965 led many to compare the incident with earlier mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle. The official report filed by the US Air Force classified the aircraft as missing, presumed lost at sea. No cause was determined. Families of the crew received the formal notification, but no further detail. The entry in Air Force records remained unresolved for decades. The Florida Straits had already been the site of earlier disappearances. In 1945, the famous Flight 19 vanished during a training mission, with 5 Avenger bombers and 14 men lost. In 1948, a Douglas DC-3 carrying 32 people disappeared on approach to Miami, last reported just 50 miles from land. Both cases had occurred in the same broad region of sea and left no confirmed wreckage. By the time the Flying Boxcar vanished in 1965, the area already had a reputation for unexplained losses. Eyewitness accounts from ships operating in the Straits on June 5 provided little information. Logs confirm normal conditions. Crews reported calm seas and steady skies. None recorded anything unusual at the time of the C-119's disappearance. The absence of reports added to the sense of suddenness. Whatever occurred to the aircraft had happened quickly and without drawing attention. Newspaper coverage of the incident was limited. A few brief articles appeared in Florida papers, noting a missing Air Force transport. The Cold War context again influenced reporting. Military incidents that lacked immediate answers were often downplayed. The disappearance did not enter popular discussion until years later, when writers on aviation mysteries compiled lists of unexplained cases. The C-119 itself had a long service record. More than 1,100 were built, and they served in multiple theaters around the world. The aircraft earned respect for its ability to carry heavy cargo into short fields, yet by the 1,960 seconds, they were being phased out in favor of the newer Lockheed C-130 Hercules. Mechanical wear and age sometimes contributed to accidents, but none resembled the 1,965 disappearance in the Straits. Some researchers point to the geography of the region. The Florida Straits mark the meeting of the Gulf Stream with deeper Atlantic waters. Currents there are powerful, capable of dispersing wreckage quickly. In theory, debris could have been carried far from the disappearance site. Yet even in such cases, oil slicks or floating materials are typically recovered within days. The absence of any trace in this case remains unusual. In the years since, the incident has been grouped with the broader body of cases linked to the Bermuda Triangle. While not widely known compared to Flight 19 or the DC-3, it shares the same defining traits: clear weather, normal communications, sudden silence, and no physical remains. For researchers, it stands as another example of how even large, well-documented aircraft can vanish without explanation in a region of ocean that has long carried mystery. By the end of the 1,960 seconds, the flying boxcar had largely left frontline service. The disappearance of the 1,965 flight became one more entry in the long list of unresolved Atlantic vanishing. The men on board were never recovered, their fate marked only in Air Force logs and family records. To this day, the disappearance of the flying boxcar is recalled in collections of aviation mysteries. It remains a reminder that even in clear skies and calm seas, an aircraft can be present one moment and gone the next, leaving only silence behind. The missing DC-3 of 1,948. On the evening of the 28th of December 1948, a Douglas DC-3 carrying 32 people departed from San Juan, Puerto Rico. Its destination was Miami, Florida, a flight path that crossed directly through the region of ocean, later known as the Bermuda Triangle. The aircraft bore the registration NC-16002 and was flown by Captain Robert E. Lindquist, an experienced pilot with many hours logged on the DC-3. Alongside him was co-pilot Robert F. Blumenthal and flight attendant Mary Burke. On board were 29 passengers, a mixture of business travelers, tourists, and families. The DC-3 was a reliable aircraft of its time. Introduced in the 1,930 seconds, it had served as both a civilian airliner and a military transport during World War II. Thousands had been built, and many continued in service well into the 1,950 seconds. Known for its ruggedness, the DC-3 rarely failed without warning. That night, Captain Lindquist filed a routine flight plan and reported weather along the route as good. Winds were light, visibility was steady, and no storms were forecast. The departure from San Juan was uneventful, with the aircraft climbing smoothly to cruising altitude. The first hours of the flight passed without incident. Radio logs show the DC-3 making standard position reports as it moved northwest across the Caribbean. At 4:13 p.m., Captain Lindquist transmitted a routine message to Miami, noting the expected time of arrival. He reported being approximately 50 miles southeast of Miami, on course, and preparing for descent. His tone was calm, and nothing suggested distress. This was the last communication ever received from NC-16002. When the DC-3 failed to arrive on schedule, air traffic control initiated repeated calls. No response came. Within hours, the Coast Guard and Navy launched a large search operation. Aircraft flew grid patterns over the sea, while ships scoured the waters between Bimini and Miami. Despite days of searching, no wreckage was found. No oil slicks, no floating debris, and no bodies were recovered. The aircraft and its 32 occupants had vanished completely within sight of its destination. Investigators reviewed the details carefully. Maintenance records showed the DC-3 had undergone recent inspection. One irregularity was noted. The aircraft's batteries were not fully charged before departure. However, this would have affected only certain onboard systems, not the engines or primary controls. The aircraft was otherwise airworthy. Fuel capacity was sufficient and weight limits were respected. The most puzzling factor was the location. At the time of the last transmission, the DC-3 was said to be only 50 miles from Miami. This placed it well within the range of coastal radar and in waters heavily traveled by ships. If a crash had occurred, debris should have been sighted quickly. That nothing at all surfaced led to speculation that the last position report may have been inaccurate. Some suggested the plane was further south, while others proposed a sudden navigational error. The official Civil Aeronautics Board investigation, released in 1949, reached no firm conclusion. It listed the disappearance as cause unknown, citing the lack of physical evidence. Possible explanations included electrical failure, fuel exhaustion, or navigational error, but none could explain the complete absence of wreckage. Families of the passengers and crew received little comfort. Many had gathered in Miami expecting arrivals that never came. The case was widely reported in newspapers across the United States. Headlines described the DC-3 as vanished without trace. The story fueled early speculation about strange forces in the region, later labeled the Bermuda Triangle. The DC-3 disappearance is often compared to Flight 19, which had occurred 3 years earlier in 1945. Both involved experienced crews, good weather, and sudden silence. Both led to large-scale searches that found nothing. The similarities between the two cases helped solidify the reputation of the Bermuda Triangle in the public imagination. In later years, researchers revisited the 1,948 disappearance. Some noted that the Gulf Stream, a strong ocean current running north along Florida's coast, could have carried wreckage far from the crash site. Others pointed out that shallow reefs near Bimini could have hidden debris. Still, no evidence has ever been found despite advances in sonar and deep-sea search technology. The aircraft itself carried an unusual history. Records show NC 16002 had previously been used in the military before being converted for civilian service. It had logged many hours of operation, though nothing in its history suggested major structural issues. Captain Lindquist was regarded as a competent pilot, trusted with transoceanic flights. Co-pilot Blumenthal was equally experienced. The presence of a skilled crew only deepened the mystery. Passenger lists included travelers from the United States and Latin America. Some were on business trips, while others were returning home after holidays. For families waiting in Miami, the disappearance was sudden and final. No messages of distress had reached them, no explanations offered. Over the years, theories about the missing DC-3 have multiplied. Some writers link it to electromagnetic anomalies, suggesting compass or radio interference. Others propose sudden weather phenomena, such as downbursts or microbursts, though none were recorded that evening. A smaller number speculate about more unusual possibilities, ranging from time distortions to abductions. None of these ideas have been supported by evidence. Officially, the case remains unresolved. The final position report, calm and routine, stands as the last known record of the flight. After that, silence. The names of the 32 people on board remain on lists of the missing, their fate never clarified by physical discovery. The disappearance of the DC-3 inches 1,948 remains one of the most frequently cited mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle. Its proximity to land, its large passenger count, and its total absence of wreckage make it stand out even among similar cases. For aviation historians, it is both a reminder of the limits of mid-century navigation and an enduring enigma of flight, the Star Tiger mystery of 1,948. On the 30th of January 1948, British South American Airways Flight 138, known as the Star Tiger, disappeared without a trace over the Atlantic Ocean. The aircraft was an Avro Tudor 4, a four-engine airliner developed in Britain after World War II. It was designed for long-range routes, though pilots often noted its heavy handling and fuel inefficiency. On this winter journey, the Star Tiger carried 25 people, 6 crew members, and 19 passengers. Among them was Air Marshal Sir Arthur Conyngham, a senior officer of the Royal Air Force, who had commanded Allied air operations in North Africa during the war. The flight began in Lisbon, Portugal, and proceeded to Santa Maria in the Azores. From there, the next leg was toward Bermuda, with Miami as the eventual destination. On January 29, the Star Tiger departed Santa Maria at 3:34 p.m. local time. Weather forecasts indicated scattered showers, but nothing unusual for a transatlantic crossing. The route was expected to take about 12 hours. Because of strong headwinds, the captain, Brian W. McMillan, decided to fly at a lower altitude than normal, around 2,000 meters. This would help conserve fuel, but left the aircraft more vulnerable to turbulence. Radio logs show the Star Tiger maintaining contact as it crossed the Atlantic. Position reports placed the aircraft steadily on course, though progress was slow due to the winds. By midnight, the aircraft was approaching the midpoint of the journey. At 1:26 a.m. on January 31, a routine message was received stating that the Star Tiger was approximately 380 miles northeast of Bermuda. The radio operator gave altitude and estimated arrival time. Nothing in the transmission suggested concern. That was the last communication ever heard from the Star Tiger. When the aircraft failed to arrive at Bermuda, air traffic controllers attempted repeated calls. None were answered. An immediate search was organized by American and British forces, covering thousands of square miles of ocean. Ships and aircraft combed the waters for days. No wreckage, no oil slicks, and no bodies were found. The aircraft and everyone aboard had vanished completely. Investigators from the British Civil Aviation Board reviewed the details. The Avro Tudor was known to have limited fuel margins, especially when flying against strong winds. It was possible, they reasoned, that the aircraft had run out of fuel before reaching Bermuda. Yet, if that had occurred, a ditching at sea should have left floating debris. None was ever recovered. The official report, published later in 1948, admitted that the disappearance was unexplained. The wording was stark. The cause of the loss of the Star Tiger cannot be determined. The reputation of the Avro Tudor added to the discussion. Several aircraft of the type had suffered accidents, and pilots often complained of poor visibility from the cockpit and difficult handling in rough air. Still, the crew of Flight 138 was experienced, and Captain McMillan had previously completed long transatlantic crossings. His decision to fly low was unconventional, but not unprecedented. Passenger lists reveal a mix of travelers, businessmen, government officials, and tourists. The presence of Air Marshal Conyngham gave the flight added historical weight. Newspapers at the time highlighted his disappearance, noting that one of Britain's most senior air commanders had been lost in peacetime. The lack of any trace only deepened the mystery. The Star Tiger was one of several aircraft operated by British South American Airways that disappeared in the late 1940s. Just a year later, in January 1949, another Avro Tudor 4, the Star Ariel, vanished on a similar route between Bermuda and Kingston, Jamaica. Both aircraft were lost in clear weather, both left routine last transmissions, and both produced no wreckage despite wide searches. The 1948 disappearance quickly became associated with the growing legend of the Bermuda Triangle. Writers in the 1950 seconds and 1960 seconds pointed to the Star Tiger as one of the defining cases of unexplained loss. The combination of a routine last message, the calm tone of the crew, and the total absence of wreckage matched the pattern that would later be seen in many accounts. The official investigation files reveal the difficulty of explaining the event. Without evidence, investigators could only speculate. Possibilities included fuel exhaustion, sudden turbulence, or navigational error, but each possibility had weaknesses. Fuel exhaustion should have left wreckage. Turbulence severe enough to destroy the aircraft would have been noted in weather reports. Navigational error might have placed the plane far off course, but then debris should have been found elsewhere. To this day, no trace of the Star Tiger has ever been located. Advances in sonar mapping and underwater searches in later decades have not revisited the case, as the potential search area is vast and deep. The Atlantic Ocean has absorbed the aircraft and its occupants entirely. Among aviation historians, the disappearance remains one of the most notable unsolved mysteries of the post-war era. It stands as both a technical puzzle and a human tragedy. Families of the passengers waited in Bermuda and Miami for news that never came. The final words of the crew, calm and routine, are preserved in logbooks, marking the last known moments before silence. The loss of the Star Tiger is remembered today not only for its place in the Bermuda Triangle narrative, but also for the presence of Air Marshal Conyngham, whose distinguished wartime career ended without explanation in peacetime skies. The case remains a striking example of how even modern aircraft, flown by experienced crews, could vanish without warning or trace. The Star aerial disappearance of 1949. On the 17th of January 1949, less than 12 months after the loss of the Star Tiger, another Avro Tudor 4, belonging to British South American Airways, vanished without leaving a trace. This aircraft, named the Star Aerial, was scheduled to fly from Bermuda to Kingston, Jamaica. It carried 20 people, 7 crew, and 13 passengers. The captain in command was John Clutha McPhee, a skilled pilot with thousands of hours of flight experience, including many transatlantic crossings. By reputation, McPhee was considered steady and reliable. The Star Aerial took off from Kindley Field, Bermuda, at 8:41 a.m. Weather conditions were ideal. Reports described the sky as almost entirely clear, with calm winds and excellent visibility across the route. The air was so stable that Captain McPhee chose to climb higher than usual, settling into a cruising altitude of 18,000 feet. With no clouds or storms, navigation should have been simple, and the flight was expected to be routine. At 9:32 a.m., Captain McPhee made what would become his last known transmission. He reported position, altitude, and course, noting that everything was operating normally. He added the estimated time of arrival in Jamaica. The tone was calm and ordinary, without suggestion of difficulty. After that, silence fell. When the aircraft failed to arrive in Kingston on schedule, controllers attempted repeated radio contact. No answer came back. Within hours, a full search operation was organized. American, British, and Caribbean forces joined together, deploying ships and aircraft to cover the route between Bermuda and Jamaica. They swept across thousands of square miles of calm ocean. Despite clear weather and excellent visibility, they found nothing. Not a single piece of debris, no bodies, no oil slicks, and no sign of a descending aircraft. The Star Aerial had disappeared as completely as its sister ship, the Star Tiger. Investigators were troubled because conditions had been so favorable. There were no storms that might have disrupted the flight, no reports of turbulence, and no evidence of equipment malfunction. The Avro Tudor 4, while not universally liked by pilots, had been cleared for service. Maintenance records before departure confirmed the engines, fuel systems, and structure were in order. That no distress call was sent strongly suggested that whatever happened to the aircraft was sudden and total. The Civil Aviation Board of Britain opened an inquiry. Their final report, issued later in 1949, admitted that no cause could be established. The wording was blunt. The cause of the loss of the Star Aerial cannot be determined. The case was filed alongside the growing list of unexplained disappearances in the Western Atlantic. Passenger lists from the Star Aerial show a mixture of businessmen, government officials, and private travellers moving between Bermuda and Jamaica. For the families waiting in Kingston, the loss was devastating. Many had already lived through the tension of the Star Tiger's disappearance the year before. That 2 Avro Tudor aircraft from the same airline could vanish without a trace within such a short time span deepened both grief and suspicion. Aviation experts at the time considered conventional explanations. Some suggested explosive decompression or engine fire, but such failures normally allowed for at least a brief emergency transmission. Others proposed catastrophic mid-air breakup, perhaps due to structural weakness. Yet, with skies clear and seas calm, floating debris should have been visible. The absence of even the smallest fragments challenged every explanation. The Avro Tudor 4 itself had a difficult reputation. Developed from the wartime Lancaster bomber, it was adapted quickly for passenger service in the late 1940s. Pilots criticized its cockpit layout, poor forward visibility, and inefficient fuel usage. Yet despite these flaws, it had completed long-range flights before. Still, the twin losses of the Star Tiger and Star Ariel destroyed confidence in the type. British South American Airways soon retired the Tudor fleet, shifting to other aircraft. The double disappearance also influenced aviation history more broadly. The Star Tiger and Star Ariel are frequently listed together in discussions of the Bermuda Triangle. Both involved calm last transmissions, perfect flying weather, and total absence of wreckage. Both were Avro Tudors operating for the same airline. Both were lost within a year. Together, they gave strong weight to the idea that this region of ocean was prone to mysteries that resisted conventional explanation. Newspapers in 1949 emphasized the strangeness. Headlines in Britain, Bermuda, and the Caribbean described the disappearance as another star gone. Editorials noted that confidence in British post-war aviation had been shaken. Families of the passengers and crew received official notifications of presumed loss at sea, but nothing more. The suddenness of the disappearance, paired with the lack of answers, left them without closure. Decades later, researchers revisited the case with the benefit of hindsight. Some argued that navigational errors caused by magnetic anomalies could have misled the crew, though no hard evidence supports this. Others looked to design weaknesses in the Tudor aircraft, but even so, a sudden failure without wreckage remains unlikely. In the absence of physical evidence, speculation has always outpaced explanation. The Star Ariel is often described as one of the purest mysteries of aviation because conditions were so perfect. Unlike other disappearances linked to storms, compass failures, or night flights, this one took place in daylight, with cloudless skies and good visibility. Nothing was seen, nothing was heard, and nothing was found. For British South American Airways, the impact was severe. Public confidence collapsed after two major losses. The Tudor fleet was grounded and soon withdrawn. Within a few years, the company was absorbed into the newly formed British Overseas Airways Corporation. The Star Tiger and Star Ariel disasters effectively ended the airline's independence. Today, the Star Ariel survives only in logs, reports, and the memories of those who waited for news in 1949. Its last transmission, calm and precise, marked the end of all known contact. The silence that followed has endured for more than 70 years. Alongside the Star Tiger, it remains one of the defining aviation mysteries of the post-war world. The Navy's Flight 19 of 1945. On the afternoon of the 5th of December 1945, 5 US Navy TBM Avenger torpedo bombers lifted off from the Naval Air Station at Fort Lauderdale, Florida. This was a routine training mission, designated Navigation Problem Number 1. The plan required the formation to fly east from Florida, turn north, then west, completing a triangle before returning to base. The squadron was led by Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, a combat veteran with more than 2,500 hours of flight experience, much of it accumulated in the Pacific during World War II. The weather that day was considered favorable. Winds were light, seas were moderate, and visibility was good. The Avengers, rugged aircraft known for their endurance, carried 3-man crews, giving a total of 14 men on board. They took off at 2:10 p.m., climbing steadily into the skies above Florida. Radio operators logged routine transmissions as the planes began their exercise. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The first sign of difficulty appeared around 3:40 p.m. when Taylor's voice came over the radio. He reported that his compasses were malfunctioning. Believing he was over the Florida Keys, he instructed his men to fly northeast. In reality, later reconstruction showed the squadron was already over the open Atlantic, far from where Taylor believed. His misjudgment meant the formation was being carried farther from land with every passing minute. The confusion quickly deepened. Radio transcripts reveal exchanges between Taylor and his trainees. Some pilots suggested turning west, which would have brought them toward Florida, but Taylor remained convinced they were in the Keys and insisted on continuing east. "Both of my compasses are out," he was heard to say. "I am trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I am over land, but it's broken. I'm sure I'm in the Keys." Controllers on the ground urged the squadron to turn west, but their instructions were either not followed or not received clearly. As the hours passed, fuel levels dropped. Darkness approached. The squadron's last confirmed transmission came at 6:20 p.m., with Taylor stating that they would keep the group together until fuel ran out. At 7:04 p.m., one final faint message was picked up. All planes close up tight. We will have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together. After that, silence. When the squadron failed to return, the Navy launched one of the largest air and sea searches in history up to that time. More than 300 aircraft and dozens of ships scoured an area of over 250,000 square miles. The search continued for 5 days. Despite the enormous effort, no wreckage, no rafts, and no bodies were ever found. The mystery was compounded by the loss of a rescue aircraft on the same evening. A PBM Mariner flying boat with 13 men aboard took off from Banana River Naval Air Station at 7:27 p.m. to search for Flight 19. About 20 minutes later, it sent a brief routine message, then vanished. Witnesses aboard a tanker in the region reported a fireball in the sky, and investigators later concluded that the Mariner had exploded due to fuel vapor ignition, a known hazard for that aircraft type. Unlike Flight 19, the disappearance of the Mariner was attributed to a probable accident. Still, no wreckage was ever recovered. The Navy's official report on Flight 19 reflected the uncertainty. One draft cited pilot error and pointed to Taylor's navigational confusion, yet the final version softened its conclusion out of respect for Taylor's record, stating only that the flight was lost due to causes or reasons unknown. This phrasing left open the possibility that mechanical failure or other factors had played a role. The disappearance of Flight 19 captured the attention of newspapers across the United States. The idea that 5 aircraft and 14 men could vanish on a training mission in daylight under relatively good weather struck many as extraordinary. The simultaneous loss of the Mariner added to the sense of tragedy. For the families of the men, there was no closure, only the official notification that their loved ones were missing and presumed dead. Over the years, explanations have been offered. Some emphasized Taylor's error. If he had recognized that the squadron was northeast of Florida rather than southwest, a simple westward turn could have brought them to safety within minutes. Instead, by insisting they were in the Keys, Taylor inadvertently led the formation away from land. Others suggest compass malfunctions may have been genuine, leaving the crews without reliable instruments. With fuel dwindling, they would have been forced to ditch in the Atlantic, where heavy seas could have sunk the planes quickly. Still, the total absence of wreckage remains unusual. Aircraft that ditch at sea normally leave debris or rafts that can be spotted. That nothing was found after such an extensive search has fueled decades of speculation. Some point to sudden squalls or strong Gulf Stream currents that may have scattered wreckage far from the search area. Others consider the possibility of compounded errors, malfunctioning radios, inaccurate navigation, and limited fuel, all aligning to produce the disappearance. The case of Flight 19 soon became one of the cornerstone stories of what later came to be called the Bermuda Triangle. Books and articles in the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds highlighted the details, the compass failures, the confused transmissions, the silence after the final call. By the 1,970 seconds, documentaries were portraying the disappearance as evidence of strange forces in the region. For the public, Flight 19 became symbolic of the idea that the Western Atlantic could swallow planes and ships without a trace. Historians and aviation experts, however, maintain that the tragedy is at least partly understandable through human error and navigational confusion. The Avenger, though a reliable aircraft, was not immune to equipment problems. Taylor, though experienced, was unfamiliar with Florida's geography and may have been unsettled by malfunctioning instruments. The combination of his decisions and the limited endurance of the planes likely sealed the fate of the squadron. Today, the memory of Flight 19 endures. At the Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale Museum, a memorial lists the names of the 14 men. Each December, ceremonies are held to honor their service. Official Navy records still list their disappearance as cause unknown. The loss of Flight 19 remains one of the most famous unsolved aviation mysteries. It involved not a single plane, but an entire squadron operating in daylight with calm weather and experienced crews. The silence that followed their final radio message has lasted for nearly 80 years, leaving behind a story that continues to echo in aviation history. The Douglas Skytrain that never arrived. On the 3rd of July 1945, only weeks before the end of World War II, a Douglas C-54 Skymaster closely related to the Douglas Skytrain family departed from Bermuda on a scheduled flight to the United States. The aircraft carried more than 24 passengers and crew. Its destination was Washington, D.C., with planned stops along the way. The C-54 was considered one of the most dependable long-range transports of the era. It had been used throughout the war for supply missions across oceans, for troop movements, and for carrying officials between continents. With its 4 engines, long range, and reputation for reliability, the C-54 was not expected to vanish without a trace. The flight left Bermuda in mid-afternoon. Weather conditions were favorable. Reports described moderate cloud cover, calm winds, and no major storms along the planned route. After departure, the Skymaster climbed steadily to its assigned cruising altitude. Radio logs show the crew giving position reports at regular intervals. Each report included altitude, heading, and fuel status. Nothing in the transmissions indicated concern. The flight appeared to be progressing normally. Then, without warning, communications stopped. Controllers attempted to reach the crew on multiple frequencies. No reply was ever received. When the Skymaster failed to appear on approach to its first checkpoint, the alarm was raised. Naval vessels already stationed in the Atlantic were called into service. Aircraft flew search patterns along the flight path. The search quickly grew to cover thousands of square miles of ocean. Despite the size of the operation, not a single piece of evidence was found. No wreckage floated to the surface, no bodies were recovered, no life rafts, equipment, or personal effects appeared. The aircraft and everyone on board had simply vanished. The Douglas C-54 had built a reputation as one of the safest transports in service. It was a military derivative of the DC-4 airliner, with modifications for longer range and heavier loads. By 1945, it had completed countless missions over oceans. It had proven itself in the Berlin airlift, where fleets of C-54 seconds delivered supplies to West Berlin during the Soviet blockade. The loss of one in fair weather conditions puzzled both investigators and airmen. Maintenance records for the missing Skymaster showed no unresolved issues before takeoff. The engines had been inspected, fuel capacity checked, and the aircraft cleared for service. The crew, veterans of wartime operations, had logged many long flights across the Atlantic. That they could vanish without sending even a brief distress call remained unexplained. Some early theories pointed to mechanical failure. The C-54 could continue flying on fewer than 4 engines if necessary, but simultaneous failure of multiple engines might have forced a ditching at sea. In such a case, however, floating debris or oil slicks would normally be recovered. Others proposed navigational error. With radar coverage limited in 1945, a deviation from course could have placed the aircraft far from its expected route, yet the radio logs placed the Skymaster on course just before contact was lost. Searchers also expanded their sweeps well beyond the planned path, but again, nothing was found. The official record listed the aircraft as missing, presumed, lost at sea. Families of the passengers and crew received formal notifications, but little further information. For them, the absence of a crash site meant no closure. The names of those aboard remained on military rolls as missing. The timing of the disappearance attracted attention. The war in Europe had ended only weeks earlier, but operations across the Atlantic remained heavy. Bermuda was a key hub for military flights. Weather records confirm that the 3rd of July 1945 was moderate, with no storms in the area. Other pilots flying the same day reported normal conditions. The complete silence from the Skymaster remains the central puzzle. Newspapers of the time gave the story brief coverage. The American public weary of wartime losses, paid limited attention to another missing transport. Many assumed it was an unfortunate but ordinary accident, yet the scale of the search and the absence of wreckage made the case remarkable even then. The Atlantic, vast as it is, usually returns some evidence after a crash. In this instance, it gave nothing. In later years, the 1945 Skymaster was grouped with other disappearances in the Western Atlantic. The DC-3 that vanished in 1948, the Star Tiger in 1948, and the Star Ariel in 1949 all shared similar features: calm weather, experienced crews, routine last transmissions, and sudden silence. Together, these cases formed the early foundation of the Bermuda Triangle legend. Researchers have offered natural explanations. The Gulf Stream, a powerful current flowing northward along the US coast, could scatter debris quickly. Strong currents might carry wreckage away before it could be located. Others note that the Atlantic in this region is exceptionally deep, with trenches capable of hiding large aircraft. Even so, most crashes leave oil slicks, rafts, or floating parts. The complete absence of evidence in the Skymaster case remains unusual. The Douglas C-54 itself went on to serve for decades after the war. It became a fixture of international air travel, carrying passengers and cargo around the globe. Its record of reliability is well established. Yet the Bermuda case stands as a reminder that even proven designs could vanish without warning. For the families of those lost, time brought no resolution. Without wreckage, there were no funerals, no graves, and no clear cause of death. The Atlantic had erased both evidence and answers. Today, the Douglas Skymaster is remembered for its role in military logistics and humanitarian operations. Among its legacy, however, is the unresolved case of the aircraft that departed Bermuda in July 1945 and never arrived in Washington. The silence that followed its last transmission has endured for nearly 80 years, adding one more entry to the long list of unsolved mysteries of the Atlantic skies: the disappearance of the Martin Mariner rescue plane. On the evening of the 5th of December 1945, only hours after Flight 19 had gone missing during its routine training mission from Fort Lauderdale, the US Navy ordered a search and rescue effort. The aircraft assigned to the task was a PBM-5 Martin Mariner, a large flying boat built for long-range patrol, bombing, and rescue operations. At over 78 feet long with a wingspan of 118 feet, the Mariner was one of the largest seaplanes of its era. It carried a crew of 13 men, all trained for extended missions over water. Among crews, the aircraft had a reputation that was both respected and feared. Its long range and fuel capacity earned it the nickname the Flying Gas Tank. Its versatility made it invaluable for reconnaissance and rescue work during World War II, yet its design also made it vulnerable. Mariners were prone to fuel vapor leaks in their tanks and lines, a flaw that could prove catastrophic if fumes ignited. Crews knew this risk and often regarded the plane with caution. At 7:27 p.m., the Mariner departed from Banana River Naval Air Station on Florida's east coast. Its orders were to fly east, toward the area where Flight 19 had last transmitted. The weather was stable, with calm seas and moderate cloud cover. Radio operators noted that the takeoff and climb appeared routine. About 20 minutes into the mission, the crew sent a brief radio message confirming heading and altitude. The transmission was calm and offered no sign of distress. It was the last confirmed message ever received from the PBM Mariner. Shortly after, crewmen aboard the tanker SS Gaines Mills, positioned off the Florida coast, reported seeing a sudden fireball in the distance. They described a large explosion in the sky, followed by flames on the surface of the water. The blaze lasted several minutes before fading into darkness. The captain of the ship logged the sighting in detail, later stating that it resembled an aircraft exploding in mid-air and then burning on the ocean. Despite the clarity of the observation, when search vessels reached the area, they found nothing: no floating wreckage, no oil slicks, and no survivors. The disappearance of the rescue plane so soon after Flight 19 shocked naval officials. What began as a mission to locate lost aircraft had turned into a second disaster within the same day. Some investigators concluded that the fireball observed by the Gaines Mills crew almost certainly marked the destruction of the Mariner. The most likely explanation was a fuel vapor leak ignited by a spark, producing an explosion that destroyed the plane instantly. Several PBM Mariners had been lost in similar accidents during the war, and the scenario fit known weaknesses of the type. The Navy classified the disappearance as a probable mid-air explosion, yet this conclusion was built on circumstantial evidence alone. No debris was ever recovered from the ocean. The Atlantic, vast and deep, kept its silence. The combined loss of the Mariner and Flight 19 meant that 27 airmen vanished within a span of only a few hours. For the Navy, it was one of the most costly training days in post-war history. Families of the missing received telegrams noting presumed death, but few details were available. For them, the absence of bodies or wreckage meant there was no closure, only uncertainty. The PBM Mariner had been widely used during World War II as a bomber, patrol aircraft, and search platform. It carried depth charges, bombs, and lifeboats, allowing it to attack submarines or rescue downed crews. Many missions were successful, but its record also included a troubling number of accidents linked to fuel leaks. The loss of the Banana River Mariner in December 1945 became one of the most infamous of these cases. Newspapers of the time reported the disappearance in connection with Flight 19. Headlines described 5 lost planes and the rescue plane that vanished. The coincidence of 2 disappearances in one day created the impression of something extraordinary. Over the decades that followed, writers grouped both incidents together as central events in the Bermuda Triangle narrative. Investigators noted several unusual aspects of the case. The fireball sighting strongly suggested an explosion, but no physical evidence was found afterward. No distress call was ever made, despite crews being trained to transmit signals immediately during emergencies. Finally, the Mariner disappeared almost immediately after its mission began, suggesting the accident occurred close to Florida's coast. In theory, wreckage should have been easier to locate. That none was recovered reinforced the mystery. Skeptics point out that a fuel vapor explosion remains the most practical explanation. Mariners carried massive amounts of gasoline. Even a small leak could fill compartments with fumes. If the vapors reached a hot surface, ignition could destroy the aircraft instantly, leaving no time for a distress call. The fireball described by the Gaines Mills crew fit this scenario almost perfectly. Still, the lack of wreckage challenges even this explanation. Explosions normally scatter debris across wide areas. Floating wreckage or oil slicks should have been visible. The fact that nothing was recovered despite the Navy's rapid response gave the incident its enduring air of mystery. In official Navy histories, the loss of the Mariner is often treated separately from Flight 19, yet in public imagination they are permanently linked. Both involved sudden silence, both produced no survivors, and both occurred on the same day in the same region. Together, they created one of the most dramatic unsolved episodes in American aviation history. The names of the 13 men aboard the Mariner are preserved in naval records, though they are less often remembered than those of Flight 19. For their families, the tragedy was equally painful. They had been sent to rescue others, and instead became part of the same story of disappearance. The loss of the PBM Mariner highlights the risks of long-range flight in the 1,940 seconds. Aviation technology was advancing quickly, but flaws remained. Aircraft of great size and capability could still be undone by design weaknesses, accidents, or conditions beyond control. The Atlantic was vast enough to erase nearly all traces. Today, the disappearance of the Mariner is remembered mainly as an extension of the Flight 19 case. While explanations exist, the absence of physical proof leaves the incident in the category of unsolved mysteries. A single December night in 1945 saw both a squadron of Avengers and a rescue seaplane vanish into silence, leaving behind a story that continues to echo through the history of aviation. The lost Navy C-119 of 1,962. On the 7th of June 1962, a US Air Force C-119 flying boxcar departed from Homestead Air Force Base in Florida. The twin-boom transport aircraft, first introduced in the late 1940 seconds, was a familiar sight across American bases at home and abroad. With its long rectangular fuselage, twin tail, and side-loading doors, it was designed to carry bulky equipment, military vehicles, and large groups of personnel. The design earned it the nickname Flying Boxcar. The aircraft on this day carried a crew of 6 men, along with a routine cargo load scheduled for delivery to Grand Turk Island in the Bahamas. Weather conditions were favorable. Reports described calm seas, light winds, and clear skies across the Florida Straits. For such a short flight into the Caribbean, navigation should have been straightforward. After departure in the afternoon, the Flying Boxcar established normal radio contact. Its first position reports were routine, including altitude, course, and speed. Controllers noted nothing unusual in the tone of the crew. Approximately 90 minutes into the flight, a transmission was received. The message was calm, but incomplete. The crew mentioned altering course slightly, though the reason for the change was unclear. The transmission ended abruptly. No further calls came. No distress signal followed. Air traffic controllers attempted to raise the aircraft on multiple frequencies, but silence continued. When the C-119 failed to arrive at Grand Turk Island, search and rescue protocols were activated. The US Navy and Coast Guard deployed ships into the Florida Straits. Reconnaissance aircraft flew grid patterns across the region. Over the following days, thousands of square miles of ocean were examined. Despite the scale of the search and the favorable weather, not a trace was found. No wreckage floated to the surface. No oil slicks were detected. The 6 men and their flying boxcar had disappeared completely. The C-119 was considered a dependable transport aircraft. Built by Fairchild, it was derived from the earlier C-82 packet, with improvements that gave it greater payload and range. With a wingspan of over 100 feet, powered by 2 Pratt & Whitney radial engines, it could lift tanks, jeeps, and artillery. The flying boxcar had proven itself in the Korean War and was widely used by both the Air Force and Marine Corps. Crews were familiar with flying it long distances, including missions over water. Investigators reviewed the available records. Weather conditions left little room for natural explanations. Maintenance logs for the aircraft showed no unresolved faults prior to departure. The crew were experienced, with several having flown the route before. The incomplete transmission hinted at something unusual, but it was not framed as an emergency. With no distress call and no evidence from the ocean, the investigation stalled. Speculation developed around several possible causes. A catastrophic engine failure was considered, though the C-119 was capable of flying with one engine out. Total loss of both engines would have forced a ditching, but in such scenarios debris usually appears. Others proposed an onboard fire, yet the calm tone of the last transmission did not suggest an immediate crisis. In any case, even a fire should have left traces on the sea. The absence of wreckage was especially striking. The Florida Straits are among the busiest shipping routes in the Western Hemisphere. Fishing boats, tankers, and commercial vessels pass through daily. If an aircraft had gone down in daylight or evening hours, observers might have reported explosions, smoke, or wreckage. None were recorded, no signals were detected, and no evidence surfaced. The official record entered the case as missing, presumed lost at sea. Families of the 6 crewmen were notified through standard military channels. For them, the lack of wreckage meant no funerals, no graves, and no answers. The silence left behind by the aircraft became their only certainty. The disappearance quickly entered the growing body of cases associated with the Bermuda Triangle. By 1962, stories about the region were beginning to spread in both newspapers and popular books. The loss of a modern transport plane in perfect weather, without a distress call and without trace, matched the pattern already noted in earlier disappearances. Press coverage at the time was limited. The Cold War dominated headlines, and reports of military accidents were often given little prominence. Brief notices in Florida and Caribbean papers mentioned the missing transport, but interest faded within days. Only later, when researchers compiled lists of unsolved aviation mysteries, did the C-119 reappear as part of the broader narrative. Aviation historians studying the case have emphasized its similarities to earlier disappearances. The DC-3, lost in 1948, the Star Tiger in 1948 and the Star Ariel in 1949 all shared the same hallmarks: clear weather, routine, last communications, sudden silence, and the absence of wreckage. Though separated by more than a decade, the flying boxcar's loss fit the same template. The C-119 continued in US service for more than another decade. Over 1,100 were produced, many of which were later converted into gunships or firefighting aircraft. The type served through the Vietnam War before being retired in the 1,972nd. But the disappearance of the aircraft from Homestead in 1962 remained unresolved, and no evidence has ever been located. Today, the story of the lost flying boxcar is preserved in official reports and the memories of those who joined the search. The names of its 6 crew members remain on military rolls, their fate officially listed as unknown. For the families, the unanswered silence following the last calm message is all that remains. The loss of the C-119 flying boxcar in 1962 stands as another entry in the long series of Atlantic aviation mysteries. It involved an aircraft trusted by its crews, flying in perfect weather on a routine assignment. Present one moment, gone the next. The transport left behind only the vast ocean and the questions that still remain unanswered. The vanished KB-50 tanker of 1963. On the 8th of January 1963, a US Air Force KB-50 Superfortress tanker departed from Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. The KB-50 was a modified version of the B-29 bomber, reconfigured after World War II to serve as an aerial refueling aircraft. Equipped with 3 refueling hoses, strengthened wings, and updated engines, the tanker was used to extend the operational range of fighter jets during the Cold War. By the early 1962nd, the KB-50 was nearing the end of its service life, but it still played a vital role in US Air Force logistics and training. The aircraft on this flight carried 8 men. The mission was simple: a ferry flight southward toward the Caribbean, with a planned stop at a base in the region. For the crew, it was expected to be routine. Weather forecasts indicated favorable conditions, with clear skies, steady winds, and no significant storms along the route. Takeoff proceeded without difficulty. Early radio contact confirmed altitude, course, and speed. Controllers logged the transmissions as calm and ordinary. For the first 2 hours, everything seemed to proceed as planned. Then, silence. Radio operators received no distress signal. Controllers attempted repeated calls, but no reply came. Radar failed to show the aircraft approaching its expected checkpoint. The KB-50 had disappeared somewhere over the western Atlantic. When the aircraft failed to arrive, search and rescue operations began at once. Navy and Coast Guard vessels moved into the waters east of the Carolinas and south toward the Bahamas. Reconnaissance aircraft flew grid patterns across the region, covering thousands of square miles. The search continued for several days. Despite clear conditions, no trace of the tanker was ever found. No floating wreckage appeared. No oil slicks were seen. No life rafts or equipment were recovered. The 8 men and their aircraft were gone. The KB-50 was a large and powerful aircraft. At nearly 100 feet long, with a wingspan of 141 feet, it was almost identical in size to the wartime B-29 bomber from which it was derived. It carried 4 Wright-R 3,350 radial engines, capable of propelling it over long distances. It was not the sort of plane expected to vanish invisibly. That such a large aircraft could disappear in good weather without leaving even a fragment on the surface troubled investigators. Records confirm that the tanker had undergone regular maintenance before its departure. Inspections cleared its engines, fuel systems, and controls. The crew were experienced, trained in both refueling operations and ferry flights. The mission itself was straightforward. There was no indication of unusual cargo, hazardous weather, or technical issues. The official investigation concluded that no definite cause could be established. Speculation emerged almost immediately. Some suggested mechanical failure. By 1963, the KB-50 was an aging design, and structural fatigue or engine failure was possible. A catastrophic failure could have forced a rapid crash into the ocean. Yet in such cases, floating debris is normally recovered. Others proposed fire as a possible cause, but the absence of a distress call suggested that if fire occurred, it was sudden and overwhelming. No radio warning was ever sent. As with many other disappearances in the Western Atlantic, the lack of wreckage became the defining mystery. The ocean seemed to erase the aircraft completely. Families of the 8 crewmen were left only with official telegrams notifying them of presumed death. For them, the unanswered silence of the last radio message became the only surviving record of the flight. The KB-50's loss soon joined a growing list of disappearances that contributed to the reputation of the region. By 1963, the term Bermuda Triangle was only beginning to emerge in public conversation, but the pattern was already visible. The DC-3 lost in 1948, the Star Tiger in 1948, the Star Ariel in 1949, and the C-119 flying boxcar in 1962 all shared the same characteristics: calm weather, experienced crews, routine transmissions, sudden silence, and the absence of wreckage. The vanished tanker fit this template exactly. Coverage in newspapers at the time was brief. With the Cold War dominating headlines, reports of missing military aircraft were often noted and then quickly forgotten. For the public, it was treated as another loss at sea. For researchers, who later compiled accounts of aviation mysteries, it became another piece in the larger puzzle of disappearances in the Atlantic. Historians emphasize the vulnerability of older aircraft. The KB-50, though formidable in its day, was increasingly outdated by the 1,960 seconds. Many were retired soon after, replaced by the KC-97 Stratofreighter and later by the jet-powered KC-135 Stratotanker. The aging design may have contributed to the loss, but mechanical flaws do not explain the complete absence of debris. Even mid-air explosions usually scatter fragments across the surface. That nothing was found, despite favourable weather and rapid search operations, remains the unresolved detail. The disappearance was officially entered into Air Force records as missing, presumed lost at sea. No debris was ever catalogued, and no evidence surfaced to clarify the fate of the tanker. For the families, the unanswered silence endured. For the Air Force, it became one more unexplained loss in the Cold War era. Today, the vanished KB-50 is remembered as one of several Cold War aircraft that disappeared in the Western Atlantic without trace. Its story survives through official reports and through the recollections of those who took part in the search. For the 8 men aboard, the flight that began as a routine ferry mission ended in silence. Their names remain listed as missing, and the Atlantic continues to hold whatever evidence may remain. The disappearance of the KB-50 Superfortress tanker in January 1963 stands as another unresolved mystery of the ocean skies. Present one moment, gone the next. The tanker left no wreckage, no explanation, and no answers, only the enduring silence of the sea. The missing C-46 Commando of 1947. On the 3rd of October 1947, a Curtiss C-46 Commando transport aircraft departed from Bermuda, bound for Kindley Field, carrying more than 30 passengers and crew. The C-46 was one of the largest twin-engine transports of World War II. Developed by Curtiss Wright, it had been used extensively during the conflict to carry troops and supplies across both the Atlantic and Pacific. Its cavernous fuselage and powerful engines gave it the ability to fly long distances with heavy loads. By the late 1942, the aircraft was still in widespread service with both the US military and civilian airlines. The flight in question was scheduled as a routine transport mission. Passengers included a mix of service personnel and civilians, some returning from assignments, others travelling for official business. The Commando was fully fueled before departure and had passed inspection without issue. Weather forecasts described favourable conditions. Winds were light, visibility was good, and skies were described as moderate, with only scattered clouds. The takeoff itself was normal. Controllers logged early radio transmissions in which the crew confirmed altitude, speed, and course. Nothing suggested that the journey would be anything but uneventful. As the aircraft proceeded westward across the Atlantic, position reports continued steadily. The crew relayed fuel levels and estimated arrival times, indicating that all systems were functioning normally. About 2 hours into the flight, however, transmissions ceased. No distress calls were received. No urgent warnings were made. At a time when radar coverage was limited, once radio silence began, no further contact was established. When the commando failed to arrive at its destination on schedule, alarms were raised. The US Navy immediately organized a search effort. Patrol planes were dispatched from nearby bases. Navy vessels began sweeping the waters along the expected flight path. Over several days, thousands of square miles of ocean were searched. The conditions were favorable for spotting wreckage. Seas were relatively calm, and skies were clear enough for observation. Despite the effort, no trace of the aircraft was ever recovered. No floating debris appeared. No life rafts or equipment were sighted. The 30 or more passengers and crew were gone. The Curtiss C-46 had earned a mixed reputation during its years of service. Crews respected its carrying capacity and range, but some considered it a difficult aircraft to fly. Pilots noted that it required careful handling, particularly at low speeds and altitudes. Even so, the type had completed countless long-distance flights without trouble. The sudden loss of one in fair weather, with an experienced crew, stood out as unusual. Investigators began reviewing possible causes. One suggestion was mechanical failure, such as an engine fire or structural failure, but the absence of a distress call made this unlikely. Crews were trained to send even brief emergency messages if trouble began. Another theory considered fuel exhaustion, yet records showed the tanks were full at departure and the route was well within range. Navigational error was also examined, but the steady position reports before silence indicated the aircraft was on course. In the end, investigators had no evidence to support any specific explanation. The official conclusion listed the case simply as missing, presumed lost at sea. Families of the passengers and crew received official notifications, but no details beyond the fact that their relatives had not returned. For them, the absence of wreckage meant there could be no closure. With no remains, there were no funerals, no graves, and no memorials beyond a few lines in government records. The loss of the C-46 became one of the earliest large-scale disappearances later associated with the Bermuda Triangle. The elements matched the pattern: calm weather, routine transmissions, sudden silence, and a total lack of evidence afterward. Though the phrase Bermuda Triangle had not yet been coined, the commando's disappearance in 1947 became a foundational case in the narrative of unexplained vanishings in the Western Atlantic. Newspapers at the time carried reports of the missing aircraft, but coverage was brief. In the post-war years, aviation accidents were more common, and public attention was fixed on reconstruction efforts and international politics. The story soon faded from headlines. Only in later decades, as writers compiled lists of unsolved disappearances, did the C-46 re-emerge as an important piece of the puzzle. Historians note the striking resemblance between the commando's loss and later cases. The DC-3, that vanished in 1948, shared similar traits. The Star Tiger in 1948 and the Star Ariel in 1949 repeated the pattern again. Each case involved large transport aircraft, experienced crews, good weather, and a complete absence of wreckage. The C-46 of 1947 was the first of this sequence, setting the precedent for what followed. Some researchers emphasize the role of the Atlantic itself. The Gulf Stream, a powerful current running northward along the US coast, can quickly scatter debris. Wreckage that might otherwise remain visible can be carried far from the site of impact. The depth of the ocean in this region further complicates recovery. Trenches and underwater ridges can conceal wreckage permanently. Even with these factors, however, most accidents leave some sign on the surface. That nothing at all was recovered from the commando remained unexplained. The Curtiss C-46 itself continued in service for many years after the 1947 disappearance. The US Air Force eventually replaced it with newer transports such as the C-119 Flying Boxcar and the C-124 Globemaster. Many surplus commandos were sold to civilian operators, where they flew in remote regions around the world. In some places, the rugged aircraft continued working into the 1,970 seconds. Its reputation as a reliable, if demanding, workhorse only highlighted the strangeness of the Bermuda disappearance, where proven design and experienced men were not enough to prevent loss. For the families of those who vanished, the unanswered silence of the Atlantic became permanent. The absence of remains or debris left questions that could not be answered. Official records listed the crew and passengers as missing, their fate unresolved. To relatives, the loss was made more difficult by the lack of closure. Decades later, the unanswered questions still remain. Today, the missing C-46 Commando of 1947 is remembered as one of the earliest mass loss mysteries of aviation in the Western Atlantic. It marked the beginning of a chain of disappearances that would later form the foundation of the Bermuda Triangle legend. An aircraft large and proven, operating in good weather with trained men at the controls, vanished into the sea and left no trace. What began as a routine transport mission ended in silence, a silence that has lasted for more than 70 years. The vanishing Navy constellation of 1954. On the 30th of October 1954, a US Navy Lockheed R-7V-1 Constellation departed from Naval Air Station Patuxent River in Maryland, bound for the Azores. The Constellation, known widely as the Connie, was one of the most advanced long-range transports of its time. Originally designed in the early 1940s for civilian airlines, the aircraft was adapted for military use during and after World War II. With its triple-tail design and sleek fuselage, the Constellation stood out among aircraft of its era, both for its distinctive shape and its impressive range. The mission that day involved transporting naval personnel across the Atlantic. A total of 42 men were aboard. The aircraft was fully fueled, loaded with standard cargo, and had undergone inspection before takeoff. Weather reports along the route were favorable. Winds were steady, visibility was good, and no major storms were forecast in the region. The Constellation took off without difficulty, climbing smoothly into the skies over Maryland. For the first hours of the flight, everything proceeded normally. The crew sent routine radio messages to report position, altitude, and fuel status. Controllers logged each transmission as standard and uneventful. The Constellation followed its assigned course, heading east across the Atlantic. Then, several hours into the journey, radio transmissions ceased. No distress calls were received. No indication of mechanical difficulty or emergency was ever transmitted. When the aircraft failed to arrive in the Azores, search and rescue operations began immediately. US Navy ships already stationed in the Atlantic were diverted to the search area. Patrol planes flew sweeping grid patterns across the ocean. Over the course of several days, thousands of square miles were searched. Despite favorable weather and extensive coverage, no trace of the Constellation was ever found. No debris floated to the surface. No oil slicks were sighted. No life rafts were recovered. All 42 men aboard were declared missing. The Lockheed Constellation was considered one of the safest and most advanced transports of its day. Powered by 4 Wright R-3350 radial engines, it had the range to cross oceans and the capacity to carry heavy loads. Airlines around the world operated the type for long-haul routes, and the military used it for cargo, personnel transport, and reconnaissance. Its record was generally strong, though the complexity of its engines sometimes presented challenges. That a large Constellation could vanish in good weather with no distress call and no wreckage was considered extraordinary. Investigators reviewed the available details. Maintenance logs showed the aircraft had been cleared before departure. The crew were experienced naval aviators, trained for long-range transatlantic flights. The weather had been calm, with no storms that could have disrupted communications or forced a crash. The complete silence after routine transmissions suggested a sudden and catastrophic event, but with no debris, the cause could not be determined. Speculation focused on several possibilities. Some suggested a fire or explosion, either in the fuel system or in the engines. Such an event could have destroyed the aircraft instantly, preventing any radio call. Others considered structural failure. Though the constellation was well designed, heavy stresses in flight could cause sudden damage. Another theory was collision, though there were no reports of other aircraft in the area. In every case, however, wreckage would normally be expected. That none was found remained the central puzzle. The loss of 42 men made the disappearance one of the most significant mass aviation tragedies of the decade. Families received telegrams confirming that their relatives were missing, presumed lost at sea. Without bodies or wreckage, funerals could not be held. For many, the unanswered silence became permanent. Newspapers reported extensively on the incident in the days that followed. Headlines described Navy plane with 42 missing in Atlantic. Public reaction was one of shock. The Constellation was a trusted aircraft, widely seen as a symbol of modern aviation. The idea that it could vanish completely under clear skies unsettled both military personnel and civilians. Yet as days passed with no evidence, coverage faded, replaced by other Cold War events. In later decades, researchers highlighted the case as part of the growing narrative of the Bermuda Triangle. The Constellation's disappearance matched the same elements seen in earlier cases: calm weather, experienced crews, normal transmissions, sudden silence, and no trace afterward. Though the flight had not originated in Bermuda, its path across the western Atlantic placed it within the region associated with these mysteries. Historians note that the disappearance of the Constellation in 1954 added weight to the pattern of large transport aircraft lost without explanation. The DC 3 inches 1948, the Star Tiger in 1948, and the Star Ariel in 1949 all fit the same template. The Constellation, larger and more advanced, should have been less vulnerable. Yet it too vanished, leaving only unanswered questions. Some researchers point to the challenges of the ocean itself. The Atlantic is vast, and the Gulf Stream's powerful currents can disperse wreckage rapidly. Even large debris can sink or scatter beyond reach. The depth of the seabed in the region further complicates recovery. But while these factors can make recovery difficult, most crashes leave at least some sign on the surface. That nothing at all was found in the Constellation's case remains unexplained. The Lockheed Constellation itself continued in service for many years after 1954. It became a mainstay of international airlines until the advent of the jet age, when it was replaced by aircraft such as the Boeing 707 and the Douglas DC-8. In military service, the Constellation was adapted into radar and warning platforms. Its record of reliability makes the disappearance of one in the Atlantic stand out as an anomaly. For the families of the 42 men aboard, the unanswered silence endured. Names were inscribed in naval records, but the absence of wreckage meant no graves or memorials beyond official lists. Decades later, the loss remains one of the least explained naval aviation tragedies of the Cold War era. Today, the vanished Navy Constellation of 1954 is remembered as one of the largest single aircraft disappearances in the Western Atlantic. It involved an advanced aircraft, flown by experienced men in favorable weather. The sudden silence and absence of wreckage fit the established pattern of disappearances in the region. Present one moment and gone the next, the Constellation joined the long list of aircraft erased by the ocean, leaving only silence and unanswered questions. The disappearance of the C-124 Globemaster in 1951. On the 23rd of March 1951, a US Air Force Douglas C-124 Globemaster II departed from Walker Air Force Base in New Mexico. The destination was Mildenhall in the United Kingdom, with planned stops along the way, including Bermuda and the Azores. The C-124 was among the largest transport aircraft in the world at the time. Nicknamed Old Shaky by its crews, it was designed to carry heavy equipment, vehicles, and troops across continents. With a wingspan of 174 feet, 4 powerful Pratt & Whitney radial engines, and a cargo hold large enough to carry tanks or artillery, it represented the new generation of long-range heavy lifters. On this mission, the Globemaster carried more than 50 people, including crew and passengers. Weather conditions along the planned route were considered favorable. Forecasts predicted clear skies and moderate winds. The flight proceeded normally during its first stages. Position reports were received at intervals, and all systems appeared to be functioning as expected. The Globemaster made its scheduled stop in Bermuda, refueled, and departed again for the Azores. Shortly after departure, the crew reported altitude and course. Nothing in the message suggested difficulty. The aircraft continued on its assigned path into the Atlantic. Then, several hours later, radio silence began. No distress calls were received. No hints of mechanical failure or fire were transmitted. When the aircraft failed to check in at its next scheduled waypoint, alarms were raised. Search and rescue operations began immediately. U.S. Navy vessels and patrol aircraft were dispatched from Bermuda and the Azores. For days, ships and planes scoured the ocean between the 2 points. The search area stretched across thousands of square miles. Despite favorable weather and extensive coverage, no trace of the C-124 was ever found. No floating debris, no rafts, no oil slicks, and no bodies were recovered. The disappearance of such a large aircraft astonished investigators. The C-124 was enormous, dwarfing earlier transports such as the C-46 Commando or the C-119 flying boxcar. At the time, it was the largest operational transport in the Air Force's inventory. That an aircraft of this size could vanish without a trace in good weather was considered highly unusual. The Globemaster had only recently entered service, making its debut in 1950. It was designed to meet the Air Force's growing need for intercontinental transport during the early Cold War. Though crews gave it the nickname Old Shaky because of its tendency to vibrate in turbulence, it was regarded as reliable. Its cargo capacity made it indispensable for moving military equipment overseas. The loss of one in its first years of service drew significant attention. Investigators examined possible causes. One theory suggested catastrophic structural failure. The C-124 was a new design, and unforeseen weaknesses might have emerged. A sudden breakup in flight could explain the absence of a distress call. Others considered fire or explosion, possibly in the cargo hold. But in most such cases, some debris floats to the surface. Another possibility was engine failure, but with 4 engines, the C-124 could usually continue flying on reduced power. None of the theories fully explained the lack of evidence. The official conclusion listed the aircraft as missing, presumed lost at sea. For the families of the more than 50 men aboard, the absence of wreckage meant no closure. Official records provided only the acknowledgement that the flight had disappeared somewhere between Bermuda and the Azores. Newspapers at the time reported on the missing Globemaster, noting both the number of men aboard and the unusual nature of the loss. Public reaction was one of concern, as the C-124 was a symbol of America's new global reach. The disappearance of such a large aircraft highlighted the risks still faced in long-range aviation, even as technology advanced. Coverage faded as weeks passed without discoveries, but the case remained in Air Force records as one of the most significant unsolved losses of the early Cold War. In later decades, the case was often grouped with other Atlantic disappearances. The DC 3 inches 1948, the Star Tiger in 1948, the Star Ariel in 1949, and the Navy Constellation in 1954 all shared the same traits. Calm weather, experienced crews, routine transmissions, sudden silence, and no wreckage. The C-124, larger and more modern, added weight to the pattern. Historians studying the incident emphasized the improbability of such a disappearance. The Globemaster's cargo hold was massive, its structure immense. Even if the aircraft had broken apart in mid-air, debris would normally scatter across the ocean. The Gulf Stream could move wreckage, but some sign should have been visible. That none was found remains one of the defining mysteries of the case. The C-124 Globemaster II went on to serve for decades after the 1951 loss. Hundreds were built and used in Korea, Vietnam, and other Cold War operations. They carried everything from tanks to nuclear weapons, as well as troops and humanitarian supplies. The aircraft remained a backbone of US heavy airlift until replaced by the jet-powered C-141 Starlifter in the 1960s. 960 seconds. Yet the early disappearance of one Globemaster in the Atlantic stood out as a reminder of the risks that never fully disappeared. For the families, the unanswered silence of the ocean became permanent. With no wreckage or remains, there were no graves to visit, only names inscribed in Air Force records. The sudden loss of more than 50 men in a single flight made the disappearance one of the largest mass aviation mysteries of its era. Today, the missing C-124 of 1,951 is remembered as part of the larger history of unexplained disappearances in the Atlantic. It marked the loss of one of the most advanced transports of its day, under conditions that should have been safe. The Globemaster's disappearance joined the growing list of vanishings in the region, an aircraft present one moment, gone the next, leaving no trace but the silence that followed. The disappearance of the KC-135 stratotanker in 1965. On the 28th of August 1965, a US Air Force KC-135 stratotanker vanished over the Atlantic during a routine training mission. The KC-135, a jet-powered aerial refueling aircraft, was based on the Boeing 707 airframe and had entered service in the late 1950 seconds. With 4 turbofan engines and the ability to refuel fighters and bombers in flight, it represented a leap forward in Cold War aviation. By the mid-1960 seconds, the KC-135 was the primary tanker of the Strategic Air Command, supporting both long-range bombers and global fighter deployments. The aircraft departed from a base on the East Coast with a crew of 7. Their assignment was to conduct training operations before continuing toward the Caribbean. Weather forecasts showed good conditions, with clear skies, stable winds, and no major storms along the route. Takeoff was routine, and controllers recorded normal position reports during the early stages of the flight. Nothing suggested difficulty. Several hours into the mission, contact was abruptly lost. The crew did not issue a distress call. Radio operators attempted to re-establish communication, but no response was received. Radar plots showed the aircraft had been on its assigned course when the signal disappeared. The stratotanker had vanished. Search and rescue operations began immediately. Navy and Coast Guard ships were dispatched into the region, supported by reconnaissance aircraft flying grid searches. The search area extended across thousands of square miles, covering waters east of Bermuda and stretching toward the Caribbean. Despite extensive sweeps over several days, no wreckage was located. No floating debris, oil slicks, or life rafts were sighted. The KC-135 and its 7 crewmen were gone. The stratotanker was one of the most advanced aircraft of its time. Its 4 jet engines gave it higher speeds and greater reliability than earlier propeller-driven tankers, such as the KB-50. With a wingspan of 131 feet and a length of 136 feet, it was a large and powerful aircraft. The KC-135 fleet had already logged thousands of hours of safe operation by 1965. The idea that one could disappear in good weather, leaving no trace, was troubling to investigators. Records confirmed that the aircraft had undergone maintenance prior to the mission. Fuel systems, engines, and avionics were cleared. The crew were fully trained, having completed multiple stratotanker missions. The flight plan was routine, with no unusual maneuvers or experimental procedures. The sudden silence remained unexplained. Speculation among investigators focused on a few possibilities. A catastrophic structural failure was considered, though rare, undetected metal fatigue could cause sudden breakup in flight. Others suggested an onboard fire or explosion, though the absence of any distress call argued for an immediate and overwhelming event. Engine failure was less likely, since the KC-135 could continue flying on partial power. Mid-air collision was another theory, but no other aircraft were reported in the vicinity. None of these explanations accounted for the lack of debris. The Gulf Stream, with its powerful currents, was often cited as a factor in disappearances in the region. Debris could have been carried away quickly, making recovery difficult. But most accidents leave at least some floating material. That nothing was ever recovered from the stratotanker's loss left the case unresolved. For the families of the 7 men aboard, the disappearance brought only uncertainty. Official notifications listed them as missing, presumed dead. Without wreckage or remains, there could be no closure. Their names were entered into Air Force records, but the unanswered silence became permanent. The KC-135's disappearance in 1965 added to the series of unexplained losses in the Western Atlantic. By this time, the phrase Bermuda Triangle was beginning to appear in popular books and magazines. Writers highlighted patterns of aircraft vanishing in good weather, with experienced crews and no evidence afterward. The stratotanker fit the established template: normal transmissions, sudden silence, no distress call, and no wreckage. Newspaper coverage of the incident was brief. The Cold War dominated headlines, and reports of missing military aircraft were often overshadowed by larger geopolitical events. Only in later years did the stratotanker's loss become more widely discussed, as researchers compiled records of unexplained disappearances. Historians studying the case emphasized the unusual nature of the disappearance. The KC-135 was not an aging propeller aircraft, but a modern jet-powered tanker, one of the most advanced transports in service at the time. Its sudden loss, under ideal conditions, challenged the assumption that aviation progress would eliminate such mysteries. Even in the jet age, the Atlantic still erased aircraft without leaving a trace. The KC-135 stratotanker went on to serve for decades after the 1965 disappearance. Hundreds remain in service today, upgraded with modern avionics and engines. They continue to form the backbone of the US Air Force's aerial refueling fleet. Yet the case of the aircraft lost in 1965 stands as a reminder that even the most advanced machines are not immune to unexplained vanishing. Today, the missing stratotanker is remembered in official records as another unresolved loss over the Atlantic. For researchers of aviation mysteries, it occupies a place alongside earlier cases such as the DC 3 inches 1948, the Star Tiger in 1948, the Star Ariel in 1949, the Navy Constellation in 1954, and the C-124 Globemaster in 1951. Each followed the same pattern: clear weather, routine transmissions, sudden silence, and the absence of wreckage. The KC-135 of 1965 proved that the mystery extended into the jet age. For the families, the unanswered silence of the ocean remains the final record. The disappearance of the stratotanker joined the long list of unexplained Atlantic vanishings, an aircraft present one moment, gone the next, leaving only the enduring quiet of the sea. The disappearance of the P-3 Orion in 1978. On the 22nd of May 1978, a US Navy Lockheed P-3 Orion vanished over the Atlantic Ocean during what was expected to be a routine patrol mission. The P-3 was one of the most advanced maritime patrol aircraft of its era. Developed from the civilian Lockheed Electra airliner, it was modified for long-range reconnaissance and anti-submarine warfare. It carried advanced radar, magnetic anomaly detectors, and equipment for deploying sonar buoys. With a range of more than 4,000 miles and the ability to loiter for many hours at low altitude, the Orion became a cornerstone of Cold War naval operations. The aircraft that disappeared was based at Naval Air Station Bermuda, one of the most important hubs for US patrol operations in the Atlantic. Its mission on that day was considered standard, a broad surveillance and patrol assignment along a stretch of ocean east of Bermuda. 10 men made up the crew, all of them trained and experienced in long-duration flights. The weather was favorable. Forecasts described calm seas, scattered cloud layers, and no major storms in the patrol area. The flight plan was straightforward, and early transmissions confirmed that the mission had begun without issue. During the first several hours, the Orion kept up steady communication with controllers. Position reports, radar sweeps, and fuel checks were transmitted at scheduled intervals. Every report was logged as normal. The crew gave no indication of mechanical difficulty, turbulence, or navigation issues. Then, sometime near midday, transmissions ceased. The final message contained no urgency. It was routine, confirming altitude and position. After that, silence. When the aircraft failed to return to Bermuda at its scheduled time, search operations were launched immediately. The US Navy and Coast Guard deployed vessels into the sector of the last known position. Aircraft from Bermuda and the US mainland flew systematic grid patterns across the ocean, attempting to locate debris or survivors. The search covered thousands of square miles over several days. Despite favorable conditions for visibility, nothing was recovered. No wreckage floated to the surface. No oil slicks were observed. No life rafts or equipment were spotted. The 10 men aboard the Orion were missing without a trace. The P-3 Orion was not a fragile or outdated machine. It had been in service since the early 1960 seconds and had earned a reputation for reliability. Powered by 4 Allison turboprop engines, it combined range, endurance, and speed. It had been specifically designed to patrol oceans, flying low and slow for extended periods to track submarines during the tense years of the Cold War. By 1978, the Orion had already accumulated hundreds of thousands of safe flight hours around the globe. That one could vanish suddenly on a routine mission in clear weather perplexed investigators. Pre-flight inspections had cleared the aircraft. Fuel systems, avionics, and engines showed no unresolved problems. The crew were experienced and had flown similar missions many times before. Nothing about the assignment was unusual. The abrupt silence after a normal transmission suggested a sudden and catastrophic event, but no evidence could confirm what type of event had occurred. Investigators considered several possibilities. Structural failure was one. Though uncommon, stress at low altitudes could, in theory, cause a rupture. Another possibility was fire, either in an engine or in the cabin, but most fires leave some time for a distress call. Mid-air collision was suggested, though no other aircraft were reported in the vicinity. Each theory failed to explain the complete absence of debris. The official Navy record classified the incident as missing, presumed lost at sea. Families of the crew received formal notification but little else. With no remains or wreckage, there were no funerals, no graves, and no closure. For them, the unanswered silence was all that remained. Newspapers in 1978 reported briefly on the missing patrol plane. The story received limited attention before coverage faded. By then, unexplained disappearances at sea were often treated as tragic but not extraordinary. Only in later years, when researchers began compiling lists of aviation mysteries, did the P-3 Orion's disappearance stand out as part of a larger pattern. That pattern had been developing for decades. The Star Tiger in 1948, the Star Ariel in 1949, the Navy Constellation in 1954, the C-124 Globemaster in 1951, and the KC-135 Stratotanker in 1965 had all followed the same sequence. Favorable weather, normal last messages, sudden silence, and no wreckage. The Orion case of 1978 confirmed that even the most modern Cold War aircraft were not immune. Historians studying the disappearance point out that search and rescue technology had improved considerably by the late 1970 seconds. Radar coverage was more extensive. Ships carried advanced detection equipment. Aircraft had better communication systems. Yet none of these tools produced results in the Orion search. The absence of debris, despite improved methods, emphasized the depth of the mystery. For the US Navy, the loss of the Orion was entered into records and left unresolved. For the families of the 10 men, it became another chapter of grief without answers. Names were recorded in official logs, but no physical trace was ever returned to shore. The P-3 Orion type itself continued in widespread service for decades after the 1978 loss. Hundreds were built and deployed by the United States and Allied navies. They patrolled the Arctic, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific. They played roles in anti-submarine warfare, reconnaissance, and even search and rescue operations for others. Many remain in use today, upgraded with modern avionics. The aircraft's long history of reliability only sharpens the contrast with the one that departed Bermuda in 1978 and never returned. Today, the disappearance of the P-3 Orion is remembered as one of the last major Cold War aviation mysteries of the Atlantic. It marked the close of a sequence of unexplained losses stretching back to the 1,940 seconds. From the Star Tiger and Star Ariel to the Navy Constellation, the Globemaster, the Stratotanker, and finally the Orion, each case followed the same pattern. Each ended not in wreckage, but in silence. The Orion's disappearance remains a reminder that even in the modern era, with advanced aircraft, trained crews, and improved search tools, the Atlantic can still erase men and machines without a trace. Present one moment, gone the next, the P-3 joined the long list of vanishings that gave shape to the legend of the Bermuda Triangle, an unsolved mystery carried forward only by silence. The stories you have heard are not solved, and they are not explained. They remain in official records as missing, presumed lost. The sea kept its silence, and time has not returned what was taken. From the first reports in the 1,940 seconds to the Cold War years of the 1,970 seconds, each disappearance followed the same pattern: routine flights, calm weather, experienced crews, and then nothing. No distress, no debris, only silence. For the families, that silence never ended. For investigators, the cases remain blank entries in history. For us, they are reminders that progress in technology does not always answer the oldest questions. If you found these accounts thought-provoking, unsettling, or strangely familiar, you are not alone. We continue to search, to listen, and to record what remains. Join us again as we step quietly into the places history cannot explain. Subscribe and stay with us.